Okay, in this PowerPoint, we are going to discuss Plancia Magna of Pergay. Here you can see on the map the location of Pergay. It's one of several robust small cities on the plain of Pamphylia on the south coast of Turkey. Here's the view of the archaeological remains. You can see we're looking at the main bath building. It was a sizable town, maybe 10, 15,000 people. And what we know is that a lot of its edification was done by one Plancia Magna of Pergay. She didn't do this as a counselor. She had no political authority, but she assumed the post of the priest of Artemis of Pergay, an ancient priesthood with a very strange icon for the goddess. Here she is portrayed here. The town itself, magnificent city. Here is the exterior of the stadium with its vaults. Here's the interior, has a giant theater as well. It's been excavated for about 30 years by a Turkish excavation team. Here are the ancient Hellenistic towers, round towers of the massive fortification system to the city. During the empire, the fortifications were no longer necessary, and so it was converted into sort of a monumental entranceway, the interior of which formed a sort of giant interior courtyard. Here we're looking at from the inside with all these niches, and this is where Plancia Magna put up a memorial to her family. So all of her family members were statues were placed in these niches, and the whole thing was dedicated to Artemis of Pergay. Here is an inscription that says, "To Diana or Artemis by Plancia Magna." Plancius is a Latin name. We know that the Plancii of the Republic were very influential contractors, publican tax collectors. A very famous one in the age of Cicero. I can't prove she's descended from this person, but he did have his business was in the province of Asia, so in Anatolia, and so her family is a perfect example of how Romans and Italians moved overseas, settled in locally, married into the native elite populations, and therefore assumed sort of the same attitudes as the native elites vis-a-vis Rome. So they became, if you want, benefactors and defenders of their town in this regard. And what we know is that, again, she was not a counselor. But she appears to have been responsible for constructing this long water trough that extended the entire main road, about a mile through the center of the city. So we're looking at the road with colonnades on both sides, and there would have been shops to either side of the main street. And right there by the audience, you can see, right by the walkers there, you can see this water trough. Here's another view of it. It projects up about almost a meter above the ground. The water came from a spring led by an aqueduct down this extensive trough. You'll see some more views of this. Here's another view with her dedication in the background. Here are some spigot holes, so we know that people could tap into this and draw water into their shops. And here is a view of the entire length of the water trough, extending from the gates of the city all the way to the spring head, which is in the lower portion of the spring head was designed with statues of fish and Poseidon and water gushing out of them, and then water would roll down this trough. There's another view, and here is the actual cistern where the water was fed into the water trough from below. Now, again, Plancia Magnet apparently did this as priestess of Artemis. This is a major construction job, and it's a real indication of probably our best indication of how women in the provinces assumed responsibility for the maintenance and the improvements to their cities. We have other examples like her. Again, she was a member of a high ranking elite, probably descended from Roman knights. But nonetheless, she was a resident in this town and she took it upon herself to edify and improve the town. What we know is that this was a major offloading point for goods coming in from the sea. There would be large trains of mules that would then take goods up into the mountains into the interior of Anatolia. Now, they could have started their trip from any one of 5 or 6 major cities along that shore of Pamphylia, but by making the water trough right there, it was possible now for herders, for muleteers, to water their hundreds of mules there in Pergay before making their voyage. And so, in a way, Plancia made her town a more attractive place to do business, to do this transportation business, logistical business in the province. And so we can see the advantages that were the result of her foresight. We're going to complete our discussion of the status of women in the Roman world. You can see the points, the bullet points that we're going to cover: the rising autonomy of women, their access to divorce and property rights, the influence of females in the imperial palace, leading women in the provinces, and evidence of women active in the professional world. And lastly, I mean, how do we know this? How can you interpret the sources under the circumstances? So, rising autonomy of women in the Roman world. I mean, we talked about this, particularly with the catastrophes of the late Republic, all the civil wars and proscriptions. Again, what we see is the view from the top, but what we see is women assuming authority over their families and themselves, partly because maybe their husbands were dying or their fathers were dying in the wars. So women just began to assert themselves in a much more autonomous manner. It's even been discussed in publications of the liberalization of female status in the late Republic. And we all point to Clodia, the wife of a consul and presumably the mistress of the Palace, as an example of a truly autonomous woman who not only controlled her life, controlled her sexual freedom, but even asserted herself in the political arena and was scorned for this to a large degree. There's plenty of evidence that this was happening at least among the elites. And then we know, as we mentioned earlier in the semester, that Augustus tried to put this all back in the box with his laws about adultery, trying to get back to more patriarchal system of the nuclear family, which to a large degree among the aristocracy had been destroyed in his era. Didn't really succeed, but one of our problems we need to stress is that we don't know how widespread this behavior was. Maybe it's just the elites. Maybe it filtered down. One can presume that, but what we don't have is the demographics for this. Some of the evidence that we have moving on for this growing autonomy of females in the Roman world is their ability, their access to divorce if they didn't like their husbands, and also their increasing ability to manage their own assets, their property. Uh, the way they would frequently have to do this is by sort of employing a straw man to do the contractual arrangements for them. But these straw men were frequently, among wealthy families, freedmen. Women would even marry freedmen in order to control freedmen and get them to do their business for them. So there were a number of ways, shall we say, that this could be handled. And what our sources indicate is that women took advantage of this, at least those that were on their own in that regard. Another point that we made is the influence of females in the imperial palace. I mean, we talked about Livia, we talked about Agrippina the Elder, Messalina, Agrippina the Younger. Um, Again, sources are very hostile to these women and accuse them of poisoning and criminal behavior. But what they seemed to be responding to was this enormous influence of females in the imperial palace and the ability of females to sort of influence things, influence policy. And so, again, we can look at that and say, all right, well, women clearly had influence in this regard. In the provinces, we have not that many examples, but enough examples to indicate that this was sort of filtering down, at least to the elites. We're talking about the very elite elements in the provinces. So these would be women whose families were prominent in the local councils and as major property holding um, families locally at the local level. And I have another PowerPoint that I'll put up about Plancia Magna of Pergay. She's a great example of this. She was obviously a town elder. uh, engaged in mammoth construction for her community, but she couldn't do that as a counselor. She couldn't get elected to the office, so she assumed the position of a priesthood and ran the town basically in lieu of men through this priesthood. Okay. Another example I can give you is Saint Thecla, if you've heard about her. So this was a wealthy woman who became inspired by Saint Paul as he traveled through Anatolia. And against her father's wishes, she followed him and used her assets to support the missionary work of St. Paul as he traveled through Anatolia. Ultimately, she was martyred in Seleucia on the Kalykadnos in the area that I work in. And so there's this giant basilica, remains of a basilica for her. It's not her role in um, Christian, early Christian society that I'm focusing on here. It's that a woman um, could act on her own and sustain this early Christian elder through her own means. And so, how would this have been possible in another time? Becomes the question. Obviously, in this era, it was possible in that. Finally, women in the professional world. Now, this is actually mentioned in the satire of Juvenal #2 against women. So I want you to dig this out for yourself. Try to see if you can find out for this week's essay. What are the professions that women are engaged in that has Juvenal so upset? Now, you will see references to sexual autonomy. You will see references to divorce and their control of property rights, their control of the households, but they're out in the public world, according to Juvenal. And this is the point that he's making that seems to irritate him the most. Women are meddling in the public world outside of the household, which is where they were supposed to be, according to sort of an old curmudgeon like Juvenal in that regard. So that's your job to ferret out. Name some of the professions that he says they're doing. And so then we get to how to interpret these sources. Most of this information is presented to us in a decidedly negative point of view. These women are getting uppity, out of hand, out of their place, and male sources don't like this and describe it in a very negative light. Um, and what we have to do is filter this. You have to learn how to filter this information, get away from the negativity, and try to understand, okay, what is it women are doing that is making the sources so enraged, so worked up? What is so unusual about their activity in this regard? If you look at it that way, then what we see is that women were engaged publicly, privately, at all levels of society, right to the lowest levels, in a more forceful manner than in the past. And this is the message, again, given the limited information that we have, that comes to us from our sources. In general, in the Roman world, this was a better time for women in terms of their autonomy, in terms of their activities, in terms of their opportunity to engage in public life. They still couldn't um, vote, but who could? They couldn't be in the Senate or the councils. They couldn't serve in the military. But in other respects, it's almost as if there was a kind of a level playing field, and women with talent could assume positions of responsibility or positions of skill that would have been unthinkable in a previous era, even among the aristocracy of the previous. So we have to deal with that. We have to recognize that. Say to what degree, again, demographically, how widespread this was. But there are a number of examples to indicate that this may have been the best time in antiquity to be a woman. In Another question we need to ask is to what degree was this sort of a continuation of this sort of role of Roman matrons in Roman society? We mentioned that in the Republican era, it was women could get out en masse and protest when they didn't like policy or things that were happening in their society. Um, to what degree did that sort of open the door for them to begin with, as Roman norms became transcended across the entire Mediterranean? And then another thing to think about is the indication is that one of the reasons why women were assuming these positions, assuming responsibility, is because the male leadership was either deficient or was withdrawing from public. One of the questions we can ask is, if you take away the opportunity for leading men in city states to control the policies of their states, to determine war and peace, to orate, to move the assembly and what have you. If none of that mattered anymore, then what was the incentive for men to spend the enormous amounts of money they used to spend because it was required to assume political ascendancy in their communities? If this was no longer relevant, then why spend the money? And maybe leading males in society began to sort of retire to their estates, go through the motions of being, do enough to establish themselves as leading pillars of their communities, but not a penny more. And meanwhile, these communities had needs, as Plancia and Magna's constructions in her town indicated. Maybe women stepped forward because their towns needed infrastructure that the men were unwilling to spend money on, and the women kind of felt like, no, there's a need for this, and if they're not going to do it, we're going to do it in their place. And so my sense of it is, to some degree, we see these women at the local level kind of stepping forward to assume a vacuum, assume roles and responsibilities in a vacuum because men were becoming less and less interested in this because the benefits just weren't there for them anymore. So that's another interesting way to kind of contemplate this. All told, it meant that this seemed to have been a better time to be a female than in any other period in antiquity.